What do you do when the leaders you work with or their teams balk at the whole idea of using authority, hierarchy, and power? What if, because of either cultural differences or generational differences or issues of racism and oppression, people think that authority, hierarchy, and power themselves it's just a dirty word, all of them? What if they define authority, hierarchy, and power as fundamental disrespect, oppression, and inequality? So how do leaders make decisions in such an environment? How do they conduct the work of the organization when so much has come into question? What do leaders do when there's a population who doesn't value authority, power, and hierarchy? What if I told you that there was a way to walk a path where authority and respect were both honored and practiced? That's what we're going to explore in this video today. I'm going to give you 3 frameworks to help leaders tease out the productive use of authority, hierarchy, and power, and separate them from all the negative and bad connotations that have accumulated around them. The first frame is about the promises organizations make to their customers and constituents and how to match the best decision-making style of authority to those promises. I'm drawing from Daryl Conner's research on change dynamics in his book, Managing at the Speed of Change. What I love about Conner's work is that he doesn't describe what should happen, he describes what does happen when organizations are successful and what does happen when organizations are unsuccessful in creating the changes they need to make to deliver to those constituencies, their customers, and their audiences. Organizations can choose to have whatever hierarchy they want, as little or as much. For example, it can be as flat, as matrixed, or as siloed as they choose. But they have to take into consideration some really purpose structure issues that if not done well, they will fail, no matter which structure they chose. The structure has to match the pace of whatever the organization is producing in the world and the promises they've made about how many, at what cost, and when they will be available. If you look at co-ops, which historically have been very flat and consensus-oriented organizations, if those co-ops are organized solely around their own interests and timeframes, then in terms of what they have to produce, it can be completely up to them to decide when they would produce whatever they chose as the co-op's end results. Their art, their community experience, collaborative skill or tool swaps, and so forth. Now let's take a look at co-ops that are in a business environment. For example, there's an organic grocery co-op running locally in the Seattle area for over 60 years. They are incredibly grounded in their values of healthy food, sustainable agriculture, and local sourcing. They have a board of directors who are members of the co-op. However, they also have a managing hierarchy, a CEO, managers of departments, and managers of stores. So that co-op has delegated managing authority to certain members of the system because of an outside pressure to consistently produce their products and services. It's not like the co-op can say, well, we'll open the stores whenever we want to, we'll close them when we want to, take a spontaneous day off. No, they made promises to the public, which does create a sense of urgency to deliver on their own promises. So that is a hybrid structure, a co-op with a managing hierarchy hybrid. REI is another example of that. And then there are organizational structures for commerce or organizational agencies that have no sense of co-op at all. Based on the promises organizations have made to their market and how quickly decisions have to be made, that will drive how hierarchical their internal structure will be, because decision-making authority becomes more urgent to clarify the more promises they've made and to match the style of decision-making with how drawn out or compressed the timeframes are from decision to delivery. So now we're not in the territory of judging authority, power, and hierarchy as necessary or unnecessary, as good or evil, but we judge them by what is needed to produce on their promises. For example, with consensus as a chosen decision-making style, it takes the longest of any of the decision styles to make a decision because every single person has to be on board to support the decision publicly and privately. It's a very long process to get to that point. Whereas with an autocratic decision style, which doesn't mean authoritarian, those two words are often conflated in Western cultures. Autocratic simply means one person made the decision. Authoritarian has more to do with installing fascism and imposing one's will on a population in such a way that erodes democracy. Autocratic is a neutral term to describe the decision style of one person making the decision. Examples of when autocratic decision making is useful is when you've got an air traffic controller who is telling which pilots in which planes to land in what sequence, or you've got a heart surgeon who is doing bypass surgery. Those are exactly the times when you want to have autocratic decision making. You never want to hear the air traffic controller 2 minutes before landing the plane, or the heart surgeon in the middle of the bypass operation saying, well, what do you think? Which way should we go now? Let's do a majority vote. Yikes! So autocratic decision-making and consensus decision-making are the two extremes. Then there are many decision-making styles in between: consultative, majority vote, delegation. There's more time needed to make the decision the closer you get to consensus decision-making, and the less time you have to make it, the closer you get to autocratic decision-making. When talking to leaders about decision-making authority, then, it's important to acknowledge that there have been destructive decision-making processes by organizations and governments, no question. We do need to acknowledge the power overreach of corporations and nations on people's rights, and also the power overreach of corporations on both the rights of nation-states and workers' rights. But ironically, you need the power of national governments to constrain the power of corporations. So the real question for any leader is how to use power, authority, hierarchy, and decision-making in a just, humane way. We, as coaches, can be incredibly helpful to leaders when we help them to understand the full continuum of decision styles so they use the right tool for the right situation. Get realistic and clarify who has decision-making authority about which kinds of decisions. What time frames the decision makers have to make the decision. Let people know how they can participate in the decision process based on the decision style being used. Clearly articulate the decision that has been made and get commitment to that decision. The second framework to look at in terms of people's ambivalence about authority, hierarchy, and power is the classic pendulum swing that happens in organizations. There is an emotional field that surrounds this pendulum swing because it harkens back to authoritarian and violent regimes that the entire world had to witness and react to. There have been centuries of violence through slavery, and there have been whole decades in the 20th and 21st centuries of the violence of fascist governments. As an example of this emotional field, I was invited to speak to a group on authority. Some of the participants were Europeans who have had to deal with Hitler. Now, when I say had to deal with Hitler, most of these Europeans weren't even born when Hitler was alive. But the trauma of that legacy still endures as an emotional wake through the decades. Here's a little-known fact. Actually, the roots of OD, organizational development, were created as a reaction against fascism and the terror, violence, and death that people experienced from Hitler. So it's no coincidence that Process OD came out of the 1930s and 40s. Kurt Lewin, the founder of Process OD, was German. He migrated to the US when his study, work, and life became too restricted under Hitler. The whole idea in organizational development that the client owns their decision-making and that OD consultants are there to help them with collecting information from the people most affected by the situation and then introducing a process that feeds back that information to those constituencies, along with the ethic that the client owns their information and decision-making, that's all anti-fascist, pro-democracy thinking. Kurt Lewin wanted to preserve democracy because he saw the extreme threat democracy faced in the early and mid-20th century. So here's the pendulum swing. People are swinging from authoritarian violence, total control over people's lives, with whole ethnic populations being exterminated, and then swinging to the other extreme, which is, we will have none of that. It's going to be some version of self-rule, consensus, flat systems, and/or leaders with little power to invoke consequences. Bob Crosby, the founder of LEOS, the Leadership Institute of Seattle, used to say that you can see this pendulum swing in international corporations when they switch from central control to decentralized control into the regions, and then they go back to centralization and then rinse and repeat. There are these back and forth spasms because people get demoralized when the organization is too centrally controlled. People get overly constrained by it. But eventually, when they decentralize, then reliable standards and processes break down because there's no centralized quality control. And so the back and forth continues. One of the heavyweight family systems master therapists, Carl Whitaker, used to say, parents are permissive with their children until they can't stand the kids, and then they clamp down and impose order until they can't stand themselves. And that leads us to the third framework, which is the natural hierarchy that exists in families. Parents and children are not equal when it comes to decision-making power. When it comes to decision authority and the power to exercise it, it's the parent's job to create boundaries to maintain the health and safety for their kids. Which is why kids have heard, no, you can't play in traffic. You have to finish your homework before you can have screen time. You're not having chips and Coke for breakfast. This can be a helpful frame for leaders who conflate authority or hierarchical power with fascism and violence. Parents have the duty to exert their authority in a way that maximizes their children's health and safety, while not imposing their will so much that they break the spirits of their children. The only way out of this confusing pendulum swing and the need to set boundaries is for leaders to work on their presence. A leader's decisions all ring very hollow if they don't bring their presence to these conversations. It's their presence that transforms the moment. We can help leaders stay in the cauldron of these dilemmas and work on their presence, which in the context of using their authority means the ability to make wise decisions and to do it with both backbone and heart. It's our presence with our clients and the leader's presence with the team and the team's presence with each other and with the people they are serving. It's presence that makes the use of authority humane. When they have the backbone clarity and the heart compassion to match the best decision style to the decision at hand. A leader's challenge is to wake up to the times when it's important to be clear about who has decision-making authority about what issues, and to be very open to being influenced by the people impacted by those decisions. Going back to the family framework, children get very anxious when parents don't set boundaries. It may look like the kids are happy that they are that free, but it's often their anxiety that causes a lot of their disruptive behavior. They want the parents to establish the boundaries because when there are healthy boundaries, children can initiate very creatively, productively, and with higher self-esteem. When there aren't the boundaries, the kind of anxiety-producing, quote-unquote, freedom children have can corrode their own self-esteem and turn the family system upside down. Subconsciously, the kids are anxious because it looks like they are the most powerful people in the family, and even they know that's not right. Now, with adults and organizations, it's not about kids running amok, but it's about people taking initiative that may or may not be good for the organization because no one sets boundaries about where that initiative is most needed or desired. So people either shut down their initiative or use it in ways that aren't productive. Leaders need to bring both boundary setting and decision clarity, which is backbone, and be open to influence and curiosity about their team's perspectives, which is all about heart. So the challenge for leaders is to not pendulum swing between authoritarianism and libertarianism, and to not pendulum swing between total toughness and total pushover in the backbone and heart sphere. You can help a leader learn how to create a space for listening and to set boundaries. It's about backbone and heart, not backbone or heart. Even when you're in the consensus zone of decision making, you still need role clarity and decision clarity. Who has the power to do what and when? Those issues have to be very clear no matter how flat or hierarchical a system is. The boundaries and the degrees of freedom have to be very clear to everyone. When decisions and boundaries are clear, people actually feel freed up. Now, leaders often believe the opposite, but I've never seen that to be the case. When people know what the boundaries are and what the decision-making authority is that they have or that others have, they really do feel released to use the initiative that they have. And they actually are able to be more creative than when they're cautious and wondering what their degrees of freedom are. That's the creativity and efficiency and effectiveness of clear boundaries. People feel freed up to maximize their initiative within defined boundaries. Words like autocratic and power, authority, and hierarchy have become inflamed in our culture because of historical abuses. We have to admit that all these words have been splashed with blood, but there is a neutral core to them that was true before they got splashed with blood. These tools can be used humanely. However, leaders need to be so clear about what they are doing, why they are doing it, what the parameters are. That is the core work of this whole power passage on the Systemic Executive Coach Roadmap. This is why I've named our role in the power passage to be one of horse whisperer. This is a way to extend our presence into the authority space because leaders get so unnerved about using their authority. And as Carl Whitaker said, they can't stand themselves for using their authority, or they can't stand the team for acting out. It's so unnerving for them to do something different or more functional in the authority space. We become horse whisperers, helping to create a calm container with leaders so they can collect themselves. It's their ability to collect themselves, to calm down and recenter, that will help them bring their backbone and heart. I consider it pretty sacred work, these presence and power passages. The work we do in the presence and the power passages I think of as leader growing work. We help leaders become more mature human beings because adults don't arrive fully baked. We continue to mature throughout our lives. So we can help leaders mature so that they're using their authority more humanely. They have to ground themselves because for leaders to exercise their authority, it can be nerve-wracking for them and nerve-wracking for their teams, especially to be able to exercise their authority humanely. So they do need to develop, and this is some of the work we do with them, to develop the emotional maturity so that they can do that.